What if I told you that there is a set of ancient texts that could change everything we know about the Bible, and that the Vatican has never commented on them? You would probably be in shock. But what if I told you that these texts really exist, were discovered in forgotten caves more than 70 years ago, and to this day they remain shrouded in silence, conspiracy, and absolute mystery? These are the Qumran manuscripts, also known as the Dead Sea Scrolls, one of the most impressive archaeological discoveries in modern history. It revealed ancient secrets, apocryphal books, different versions of biblical passages, and hidden prophecies that simply don't hit with what we know from the official narrative of the Church. And most intriguing of all, the Vatican has never issued a clear position on them. It never even recognized the spiritual and historical importance of these documents. Why would it be? Why, to most powerful church on the planet, with access to centuries of wisdom, secret archives and one of the most restricted libraries in the world, remain silent in the face of something so monumental? Do these texts challenge doctrine? Do they expose something that has been deliberately hidden from humanity? When we talk about Vatican secrets, we think of locked documents, underground passages, burned manuscripts, and books banned by the Church. But few know that the silence over Qumran could be even more disturbing than any other scandal, because it involves the origin of faith, the construction of the biblical narrative, and mainly what the Church chose to show and what it chose to hide. This video is not just an investigation. It is an invitation to open your eyes, to delve into a truth that has been buried beneath layers of censorship, fear, and religious power. You are about to enter one of the greatest spiritual mysteries of our time. But before we reveal what these texts say and why exactly the Vatican chose silence, we need to understand what the Qumran scrolls are and why they pose such a threat to the fabric of the Christian faith as we know it. The Qumran scrolls are not just fragments of parchment forgotten in caves. They carry within themselves an immense spiritual force, texts that talk about light and darkness, spiritual warfare, hidden messiahs, and sacred laws that have been left aside. These are records that echo with an almost prophetic energy, as if they were waiting for the right moment to be revealed to the world. And maybe that moment is now. That's why, before we go deeper into this investigation, I want to make a special request to you who are watching this video with an open heart and a thirst for the truth. Write your prayer request in the comments. It could be for you, for someone in your family, for answers you have been looking for, or even for spiritual clarity in the midst of so many doubts. Yes, here is a space for revelations, but also for faith and communion. I and the entire community that follows this channel will pray together for you. Believe me, when people come together to seek the truth and connect in prayer, extraordinary things happen. And if you feel that this content touched you in any way, leave your like. This shows YouTube that this topic needs to reach more people. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because the next videos will delve even deeper into hidden documents, forbidden texts, and secrets that the Vatican doesn't want the world to know. Activate the bell so you don't miss any new revelations. Each video is like a piece of an ancient puzzle that, when completed, can change the way you view faith, history, and the spiritual. And now that you understand the importance of this silence, you're ready to discover what's really written in these forbidden texts, and why they pose such a profound threat to the fabric of traditional Christianity. Brace yourself. What comes next is disturbing. It all started in 1947, when a young Bedouin shepherd was looking for a lost goat in the caves of Qumran on the shores of the Dead Sea. He had no idea that this seemingly ordinary walk would trigger one of the most explosive discoveries in modern history. Instead of the goat, what he found were clay jars hidden inside rocky, silent caves. Inside them were rolled up ancient scrolls that seemed untouched by time, sacred texts written in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek, in a surprisingly preserved state. These documents soon caught the attention of archaeologists, historians, and of course, religious authorities. What they contained was something beyond any expectation. Religious texts dating back to before Christ, records prior to the New Testament, different versions of the known scriptures, and even more controversial, apocryphal books that had been excluded from the traditional Bible. This, in itself, would be enough to shake the foundations of modern theology. But there was more, much more, among the more than 900 manuscripts. Discovered, there were fragments from Genesis, Exodus, Psalms, Deuteronomy, as well as books you have probably never heard of, such as the Book of War, the Handbook of Discipline, the Book of Henoch, the Testament of Levi, and many other texts that appear to contain hidden spiritual instructions, descriptions of cosmic battles between light and darkness, and prophecies that do not appear in any current version of the Bible. Most of these manuscripts were attributed to the Essene sect, a Jewish, religious group that lived in isolation, focused on spiritual purity, apocalyptic practices, and preparation for the arrival of the kingdom of God. They believed that they were living in the end times and that they would be the guardians of true spiritual wisdom. Therefore, they copied and preserved these texts with reverence, as if they were a legacy for future generations, perhaps even ours. What is deeply intriguing is that, despite the historical and spiritual importance of this discovery, the Vatican remained silent. No official statement from the Catholic Church, no public notice, no institutional recognition. Why so much silence? Why didn't the greatest Christian religious authority on the planet comment on one of the most relevant biblical discoveries in history? Is there something in the Dead Sea Scrolls that directly threatens the narrative constructed by the Church? Many scholars and researchers believe so. After all, these texts not only offer different versions of biblical stories, but also present alternative views on central figures of the faith, such as the Messiah, the role of priests, the end of times, and even the origin of evil. There are passages that suggest the existence of more than one Messiah, others that describe the Messiah as a political warrior and not a spiritual savior. There are passages that mention fallen angels, imprisoned demons, battles between children of light and children of darkness, elements that resonate strongly with what many consider the hidden mysteries of early Christianity. Imagine the impact this would have on the faithful. Imagine millions of people who have always believed in a single sacred version of Scripture suddenly faced with the possibility that there were human and political choices behind the formation of the Bible as we know it. Choices made in councils, under the influence of emperors, religious leaders, and institutional interests. What if certain books were left out not because they were heretical, but because they revealed spiritual truths that challenged the authority of the Church? From there, the most disturbing questions arise. What exactly was censored? What kind of spiritual knowledge is hidden in these scrolls? What is there that is so dangerous that it was ignored by the Vatican for decades? Do these texts confirm ancient prophecies? Do they reveal deep spiritual practices that were buried to maintain religious control? What if they hold the key to understanding what really happened in the early years of Christianity, before Rome took over the faith? These questions are like triggers for the spiritual awakening of many. And perhaps that's why the Qumran manuscripts are so little talked about in the pulpits. Because they mess with structures, because they take off the veil, because they shed light on areas of the history of faith that have been purposely plunged into darkness. Now imagine for a second that some of these texts did indeed reach the hands of the Church. Imagine that parts of the content were examined, studied, even copied or translated, but never shared with the world. What if this information was locked behind the walls of the Vatican secret library, along with other lost manuscripts, letters, diaries, and documents that could rewrite the history of spirituality as we know it? It doesn't seem absurd. We know that the Vatican has more than 85 kilometers of underground archives that not even the popes have complete access to. Everything. Millennial documents, books banned by the Church over the centuries, correspondence between popes and kings, reports of supernatural phenomena, evidence of apparitions, exorcisms, and yes, possibly copies or translations of the Qumran scrolls themselves, kept under lock and key, away from the public eye. And then the question remains, what else could be in there? What secrets are buried beneath the Vatican that have never come to light? And why doesn't anyone dare talk about it openly? That's the big question. And maybe that's why you're here now, because you feel like something doesn't add up, because deep down, you know there is more. That true faith goes beyond what we have been shown. That history has gaps, and those gaps need to be filled, not with fear, but with courage. If you've made it this far, it means you're part of a generation that no longer accept half-truths. A generation that wants to see with its own eyes, read with its own conscience, and decide with its own heart what to believe. And that's why your voice is important. Now I want to invite you to comment below. I want to see the complete truth, or free the sacred texts. Write this in the comments so that YouTube understands that this type of content needs to reach more people. And if you feel like something is being hidden, share your opinion, your thoughts, or even your questions. This space is for that, reflection, questioning, and conscious faith. But there is something even more intriguing than the contents of the Dead Sea Scrolls themselves. It's silence. A thick, constant, strategic silence. A silence that screams. Since the discovery of these texts in 1947 to the present day, the Catholic Church, specifically the Vatican, has never issued an official, clear, direct statement on the Qumran scrolls. No encyclical letter, no statement from the Pope, no mention in liturgical documents, not even a brief reference in the texts of the Catechism. It's as if these manuscripts simply didn't exist, as if they weren't worth mentioning, as if what was considered one of the greatest archaeological discoveries of the 20th century, and which can directly impact the way we understand Holy Scriptures, the origin of the Christian faith, and even the identity of the Messiah, had no spiritual relevance to the body of the Church. And here comes the doubt that haunts the minds of many. Why so much silence? The Church, over the centuries, has always had a firm stance on any issue involving doctrine, the Gospels, or faith traditions. Even in delicate situations, such as the Protestant Reformation, the emergence of spiritualism or scientific discoveries that challenged geocentrism, the Vatican always responded. He always refuted, condemned, corrected, published encyclicals, called councils, reaffirmed dogmas. But in this case, nothing. The silence is absolute. And this, for many scholars, it's not chance, it's strategy. Because if the Vatican admits the relevance of the Qumran scrolls, it opens the door to a whirlwind of questions. Questions that go beyond theology, which enter the field of power, politics, the historical construction of the Church, the selection of texts that today make up the Bible, and the purposeful omission of content that could change everything, including people's faith. It is important to note that the Dead Sea Scrolls are older than most of the texts that gave rise to the Old Testament, and many of them bring completely different interpretations of biblical figures and events. There are even passages where the concept of Messiah appears in the plural. In others, the role of priests and angels is much more active and central. In some versions, Genesis presents details that are not included in the canonical version, and the Psalms, some of the songs found are practically unknown to most Christians. There are songs about justice, divine revenge, spiritual codes, and even descriptions of apocalyptic visions that were never included in the Bible. Even so, no homily, no sermon, no papal document even mentions these texts. This is especially curious if we consider that the Church's catechism, over the centuries, has always sought to update itself in the face of new archaeological or historical discoveries that involve faith. The fall of myths, such as creation in 7 days, have been reinterpreted. Earth's position in the universe has been revised. Certain historical errors of the Inquisition were recognized. But as for the Qumran scrolls, the Vatican remained unshakable, immobile, mute. Is this really theological prudence? Or is it fear? Afraid that by bringing the texts to light, a wound that is too deep in the history of the Church will be opened. Afraid that people will start to read with their own eyes and start to question more intensely everything that has been presented as absolute truth. Imagine yourself, for a moment, sitting at Mass, the priest talking about the day's gospel, quoting a traditional passage from the Bible. But you, who know the Dead Sea Scrolls, know that that passage has another version, an older version, perhaps purer, more raw, that has been removed. You raise your hand, ask, mention Qumran, and the priest responds with a confused look or an awkward silence. That's how it works. Silence repeats itself, reproduces itself, teaches itself. What is not spoken becomes invisible, and the invisible over time ceases to exist. But not everyone forgets, and that's why you're here. Because there is something in you that no longer accepts this type of manipulation. Because you feel it exists a truth, hidden within the walls of the Vatican, among the dark tunnels of his secret library, among the archives that can only be accessed with papal authorization. You feel like something bigger is being veiled, and maybe it's not just Qumran. Perhaps the Church's silence is just the tip of the iceberg, a smokescreen to not only hide the contents of the Dead Sea Scrolls, but also cover up other forgotten documents, erased Gospels, testimonies that were erased from official history. Gospels like that of Thomas, that of Philip, that of Mary Magdalene, all considered apocryphal, all excluded from the biblical canon, all loaded with messages that could radically change our perception of Jesus, the kingdom of God, and real spirituality. And here comes one of the biggest pains for the public who seek this type of knowledge. The feeling that we have been deceived, that they taught us only fragments, who chose what we could know, and discarded the rest, not by chance, but out of convenience. Why maintaining control requires storytelling, and storytelling requires editing. Editing requires cuts. So when you realize that there are older, deeper, more mysterious texts, and they have been deliberately ignored, something inside you stirs, something wakes up, and this awakening is the first step towards a truer, freer faith, more connected with the origin. Perfect. Let's continue exactly where we left off, now delving into the differences between the texts of the Dead Sea Scrolls and the traditional Bible. The focus is on alternative versions of Genesis and the Psalms, in the messianic figures who are not Jesus, and in prophecies that contradict the official narrative of Christianity. Here is the plain text, about 5,000 characters, maintaining the connection to the next part, with a persuasive tone and engaging language, without conclusion, as requested. Have you ever wondered what is actually written in these manuscripts? Because it's one thing to know that they exist. Another, completely different, is to face their content head-on. When we delve into the texts found at Qumran, it feels like we are unearthing a part of the truth that has been hidden for millennia. Not because it was irrelevant, but because it was too dangerous to reveal. And the reason is simple. The Dead Sea Scrolls show a Christianity much more diverse, complex, and enigmatic than the one we know today. Starting with Genesis, one of the best-known texts in the Bible, present since the first teachings of Christian childhood. The creation of the world in 7 days, Adam and Eve, the fall in Eden, the serpent, the tree of knowledge. But the manuscripts found at Qumran bring significant variations of this narrative. There are versions in which the time of creation does not follow the days as they were canonized. There are passages in which the serpent has a much deeper and spiritual symbolic role, and others in which the fall of man seems to be part of a greater cosmic plan, as if the fall were not a failure, but a necessary rite. And when we look at the Psalms, those sacred songs that make up much of Christian liturgies, we discover that not all the Psalms that existed came to us through the traditional Bible. Many were deleted, others modified. In the Qumran manuscripts, there are Psalms that speak of an invisible spiritual war, of celestial creatures that interact with humanity, of secret codes that should only be passed between initiates. Some of these songs reveal a worldview that is much closer to Jewish mysticism than to the Roman doctrine consolidated centuries later. And most impressive, several of these psalms do not even directly mention God as a unique figure, but rather as a manifestation of a superior energy alongside other spiritual beings, in a reality where heaven and earth mix. These nuances are annoying, and they are very uncomfortable, because they challenge the simple and dogmatic structures imposed by tradition. And if the Psalms are different, and if Genesis has another version, what else has been changed? This is where the content becomes even more delicate. Why the manuscripts also contain direct references to messianic figures, and surprisingly, not all of them refer to Jesus Christ. For those who have always been taught that the Messiah is unique and that Jesus is the fulfillment of Old Testament prophecies, this revelation can be disconcerting. In the Qumran texts, for example, there are clear descriptions of two types of Messiah: the Aaron's Messiah, linked to the priestly lineage, and the Messiah of Israel, with a political and warrior role. In some interpretations, these two characters should act together in the restoration of the kingdom of God. This idea completely breaks with the doctrine of the unique and suffering Messiah, as represented by Jesus in the New Testament. More than that, some scholars suggest that the Essenes, authors of the manuscripts, they expected the arrival of a Messiah with supernatural powers, but who would also act as a military leader against Rome. This calls into question the entire image of an exclusively peaceful and spiritual Jesus. And as if that weren't enough, there is prophecies in the Dead Sea Scrolls that simply contradict the official Christian narrative. In one of the texts, a time of darkness is described that precedes the coming of the kingdom, but this time would not be overcome by faith in a crucified Savior, but by elevation of spiritual knowledge among the children of light. This moves deeply away from the concept of salvation by grace, replacing it with a kind of gnosis, a search for inner knowledge that liberates, something that is much more reminiscent of Gnostic and apocryphal doctrines than the teachings of the institutionalized church. There are also excerpts that describe cataclysmic events, earthquakes, battles in the heavens, signs in the stars, which are not associated with the second coming of Christ, as the Gospels preach, but rather with the fulfillment of cosmic cycles defined by ancient celestial laws. It's almost as if the manuscripts are aligned with a forgotten spiritual worldview, prior to dogma, prior to councils, prior to the church itself. Imagine the impact of all this being read in public, discussed in catechesis, mentioned in homilies. How would traditional faith resist? How would religious institutions, which were based on a consolidated narrative, deal with this flood of information that destabilizes the columns of doctrine? Maybe that's why the Vatican's silence has been so convenient until now. Because speaking openly about these texts would be like opening a crack in the wall that supports the official faith. And the question that keeps echoing in the back of the mind of those who discover all this is how many truths were hidden? How many revelations were suppressed in the name of control? How many versions of the history of salvation were buried because they did not fit the narrative that interested the power of the time? These forbidden texts, these hidden versions, these unrecognized prophecies, all of this could be saying, between the lines, that faith as we know it is just a part of something much bigger, much older, and much deeper. That sacred history is full of cuts, edits, and intentional silences. And now, after everything you've heard so far, I want to invite you once again to leave your mark in the comments. Write the sentence, "There is more than we were told." Repeat, "There is more than we were told." This phrase is not just a comment, it is an affirmation, a resistance, a call. Also, write what you think about it. How do you feel about these revelations? And if you want, tell us where you're watching from, because this community we're building is made up of searchers all over the world, united by the same desire. Unearth the truth that has been hidden for centuries. And stay here, because in the next part, we'll dive into the hidden prophecies that could reveal the future of humanity, and which were ignored, rejected, and silenced by the church itself. Now imagine for a moment what happens when all this comes to light. When these alternative versions, these forgotten messianic figures, these prophecies that contradict the traditional narrative, begin to be seen not as myths, but as real parts of a story that have been deliberately edited. The impact is profound. We are not just talking about different texts or isolated interpretations. We are talking about documents that, when exposed, call into question the very structure of institutionalized Christian faith. And that, for many religious authorities, is a risk that simply cannot be taken. Because the Christian faith, as it is presented to the world, is not just based on spirituality. It is sustained by a meticulously organized doctrinal construction over centuries, where each part of the Bible was chosen, organized, and taught to form a central narrative. This narrative needs coherence, control, and continuity. It needs a single Messiah, harmonized texts, prophecies that point in a single direction, and any material that deviates from this path represents a direct threat to the basis of everything. This is where the notion of plurality of messiahs. The Dead Sea Scrolls show that, for the Essenes, a religious group that possibly preserved these texts for hundreds of years, there was not just one Messiah expected, there was two. A priestly Messiah, linked to the lineage of Aaron, and another political Messiah, a descendant of David, with a military role. This division is devastating to traditional Christian theology, which is based on the idea that Jesus Christ was the unique and definitive fulfillment of all messianic prophecies of the Old Testament. If the Essenes truly expected two messiahs, then Jesus' arrival would not be the endpoint of the messianic promise, but perhaps only a fragment. And even more, if the expected Messiah should also have a warrior role, liberating Israel against Rome, and this did not happen to Jesus in the way they expected, perhaps the Messiah portrayed in the manuscripts is not him, or perhaps he is just one version among many possible. These ideas open space for another line of thought. What if the figure of the Messiah was adapted, softened, shaped over the centuries by the Church, to better fit into a system of domination and obedience? After all, a suffering Savior who preaches love for others and submission to suffering is much more useful in keeping the people under control than a warrior, revolutionary, and liberating Messiah. The change in messianic profile, therefore, may have been strategic. And when we talk about this, we automatically fall into another even more uncomfortable question: the origin of the Bible and the process of selecting books that today are considered inspired by God. Because if there were so many texts circulating at the time of Jesus and the early Christians, many of them with completely different views of what we now call Christian doctrine, why were only some chosen and the others rejected? What the Dead Sea Scrolls reveal to us is that early Christianity was much more varied, with multiple theological strands, some even incompatible with each other. There were currents that saw Jesus as human, others as divine from birth, some that considered him enlightened, others that saw him as an archetypal symbol. Some advocated physical resurrection, others spiritual resurrection. Some practiced secret rituals, others denied any liturgy. And there were still groups, like the Essenes, who didn't even recognize Jesus, or saw him as just another prophet among many. With this level of diversity, it was necessary to establish a standard, and that's exactly what happened. In councils, especially that of Nicaea in 325 AD, the Church, now allied with the Roman Empire, chose which books would enter the biblical canon and which would be left out. The decision was theological, but also deeply political. Texts that spoke of multiple messiahs, that extolled individual spiritual knowledge, or that challenged the authority of religious leaders, were labeled heretical, banned, and destroyed. But not completely. Many survived in hiding, and the Dead Sea Scrolls are proof of that. The great truth is that the Bible we have today is the result of curation by men with well-defined interests, and not necessarily a pure collection of divinely ordained texts. This does not take away the spiritual value of the Bible, not at all, but it forces us to recognize that there is a part of the history of faith that has been silenced. And perhaps the reason for the Vatican's silence is exactly this: not wanting to reopen wounds that expose the seams of the sacred fabric. It is as if the Qumran scrolls are a time capsule that the Church fears will be opened, because inside is the draft of faith, the outline of a spirituality that is freer, more open, more diverse, and therefore less controllable. And when people realize this, when they understand that there was a human choice behind institutional faith, something changes forever. That is the real threat. It's not just the content of the texts. That's what they represent. They are the mirror of everything that was left behind, everything that was silent, everything that could have been and was not, by the decision of men and not of God. And you, who are here now, watching, listening, reflecting, you feel it. You realize that your faith, your search for answers, is not against God. On the contrary, it's for God. It's true. It's for light. And light is not afraid of the truth. Light does not need silence. Light does not hide behind golden walls and secret files. And if the contents of the Qumran scrolls were not disturbing enough, there is another even darker detail. What was done with these texts after their discovery? Because it's one thing to find ancient documents that challenge the basis of the Christian faith. It's quite another to control who has access to them, how they are translated, and what is or is not disclosed to the public. And at this point, Many scholars raise an accusation that has been circulating behind the scenes of biblical archaeology for decades. The Vatican would have tried to directly influence the translation and interpretation of the Dead Sea Scrolls. It may seem like a conspiracy theory, but when you look at the facts, you start to realize that the pieces fit together uncomfortably. Soon after the discovery of the manuscripts, a team was formed to analyze them, translate the texts, and organize their publication. This team was mainly composed of specialists linked to the Catholic Church, many of them under the direct or indirect influence of the Roman clergy. For years, decades in fact, only a restricted circle of academics had access to the original manuscripts, which generated criticism from the international community of researchers. Various archaeologists, historians, and linguists reported the blocking of access to documents, claiming that the Vatican, through its representatives, was interfering in the translation process. And not only that, the complaints indicated that parts of manuscripts were being withheld, edited, or published out of context, in a way minimize the impacts that could cause to traditional Christian doctrine. For many years, the argument used to justify this retention was that of conservation of materials and complexity of translations. But with the advancement of technology and the emergence of digital copies, this argument has lost strength. Even so, the release of texts continued to be done in stages, selectively, with strict editorial control. This provoked the revolt of several independent scholars, especially secular archaeologists, who demanded transparency and unrestricted access to documents. These conflicts intensified in the 1980s and 1990s, when some researchers began to publish excerpts from manuscripts in parallel, breaking with the exclusivity system maintained for decades. The reaction was immediate: lawsuits, academic censorship, veiled threats, and even attempts to publicly defame those who dared to question the official version of translations. Many have been called charlatans, heretics, conspiracy theorists. Their careers were tarnished, their names marginalized from the great academy. But what were they trying to reveal? What bothered you so much? According to these scholars, the texts that were being omitted, or translated in a biased way, included descriptions of ancient spiritual practices, references to messianic figures that were not compatible with Jesus, apocalyptic accounts that contradicted the traditional Book of Revelation, and mainly, an occult knowledge that suggested that original spirituality was much more symbolic, mystical, and free than the dogmatic structure built later by Rome. An emblematic case involves the Father Roland de Vaux, one of the first people responsible for the manuscript translation team. He was a French Dominican directly linked to the Church, and for many years was accused of intentionally delaying the publication of the most controversial documents. After his death, several documents revealed that he had withheld some texts because he considered them dangerous to the faith. Realize the weight of this. We're not talking about just any archaeologist. We're talking about a direct representative of the Church deciding what should or should not be revealed to the world. This raises a central question. Who has the right to decide what is or is not spiritual? What should or should not be read? For a long time, the answer to this question was in the hands of religious institutions, especially the Vatican. But the Dead Sea Scrolls got out of control. And even with all the attempts to suppress it, fragments of what was found began to circulate, thanks to the efforts of independent researchers, many of them persecuted for simply trying to show the world what was before our eyes. The implications are immense, because if the Church tried, and to some extent succeeded, to control the narrative of these texts, then it not only silenced parts of the story, but reconstructed a new story based on what was convenient for him. The general public continued to receive the filtered version. The complete truth? This was reserved for the few, for those who knew too much, for those who dared to see too much. And that's what hurts so many people who are waking up to this reality. It's not just a question of faith, it's a question of law, right to know, to question, to think freely, because no one should be prevented from accessing their spiritual heritage. No one should be separated from the truth by the decision of leaders who often act more as power managers than as spiritual guides. And you feel it. Do you feel that there is something wrong with the fact that texts that could broaden our understanding of the divine have been withheld for so long? He feels that there is a manipulation going on, a continual attempt to protect a structure that is about to crumble in the light of revelation. Therefore, if this content has touched you in any way, if you feel the need to express this indignation, this desire for spiritual justice, I invite you to leave a comment right now with the phrase, "The truth cannot be controlled." Write this, "The truth cannot be controlled." And if you want to share your thoughts, your doubts, or even your pain, do so. Because here, in this space, no one will silence your voice. Perfect. Here is the detailed continuation and race of your itinerary, with approximately 5,000 characters, addressing in depth the Vatican's silence strategy, the political game of neither denying nor recognizing, and how this serves to avoid. And then we come to one of the most subtle, and at the same time most effective, strategies used by the Vatican over the centuries. Silence as a form of narrative control. Instead of directly denying something, or openly taking a stance against certain information, what the Church often does is simply not officially recognize. And this is much more powerful than it seems at first glance. Why silence does not create controversy. It does not make headlines. It does not fuel public debates. It simply erases the issue from the collective consciousness. This is exactly what happened, and continues to happen, with the Dead Sea Scrolls. At no point did the Vatican come out and say, "These texts are false," or "They have no spiritual value." That would be too risky, because denying an archaeological find of world historical value could undermine the credibility of the Church itself. So instead what you do is the opposite. Nothing. No communique, no official note, no papal pronouncement. The silence is absolute, but not by chance. It's a strategic choice. Why? By not commenting, the Vatican avoids attracting the spotlight, avoid generating curiosity, avoid planting seeds of doubt in the minds of believers. And this silence has an anesthetic effect. For most people who fully trust the authority of the Church, what is not spoken simply does not exist. If the Pope didn't mention it, if the priests didn't explain it, if it's not in the catechism, then it must not be important. This is the predominant thought among more traditional Catholics, and that is precisely why this strategy is so effective. Why silencing a subject is not just omitting information, it is also shaping reality. The Vatican knows this, and you also know that we live in an era where information travels quickly. A botched denial could turn into an international scandal. A thoughtless recognition can become ammunition for skeptics, independent researchers, and critical scholars of the doctrine. Therefore, the choice not to speak is a form of self-preservation. It is an institutional mechanism that aims to avoid internal fissures, unnecessary controversies, and, above all, the division of the herd. Just imagine if the Church decided overnight to issue an official note saying that it recognizes the existence of texts that present alternative versions of the creation of the world, the Psalms, and the figure of the Messiah. What would happen? One part of the faithful would enter into crisis, another would demand explanations, priests would be pressured at the altars, debates would arise in each prayer group, each retreat, each catechesis meeting. Order would be shaken, the unit put at risk. And all this for something that, from an institutional point of view, can be avoided with a single action: stay silent. And here is the paradox. The more the Church remains silent, the more it protects its structure, and the more it distances the faithful from the possibility of knowing the complete truth. Because when there is no positioning, there is also no basis for questioning. When there is no affirmation, there is no room for contradiction. And so time passes, the documents remain locked, the files remain hidden, and the masses continue to repeat only what they were authorized to learn. This kind of silence is an instrument of power. It works in an almost invisible but profoundly effective way. It's a kind of indirect censorship, not the one that burns books in public, but the one that never let the book reach the public. And this tactic is not new. It has been used for centuries, not only with texts such as those from Qumran, but also with apocryphal gospels, letters from dissident theologians, testimonies of martyrs who challenged the system, and even with historical documents that report dark aspects of the Church's trajectory throughout the Middle Ages. It's a pattern, consistently repeated behavior, and behind this pattern is the same goal: protect the image of the Church as the sole guardian of spiritual truth. Anything that challenges this image is silenced, ignored, delegitimized, or classified as heresy. And if today the Dead Sea Scrolls are still unknown to a large part of the faithful, it is not because their content is irrelevant. On the contrary, it's because this content has the potential to destabilize the pillars of traditional faith. The idea of multiple messiahs, the alternative versions of sacred texts, the prophecies that speak of children of light in spiritual warfare with hidden forces, the valorization of inner knowledge above blind obedience. All of this directly confronts the hierarchical structure that governs institutionalized Christianity. And this is not an accusation against faith. It is a call to conscience. Because silence, when it is not neutral, becomes complicity. When you remain silent in the face of a truth, you choose to protect a lie. And in this case, the Church's omission of the Dead Sea Scrolls is, at the very least, a political choice, and not a spiritual one. And you feel it. You who are watching, who are listening carefully, who are connecting the dots. You know that this silence is not a coincidence, that it is intentional, that it is functional, and that, behind it, there is a structure that even today decides what you should and shouldn't know about your own faith. What if the faith we were taught from childhood is not exactly the faith that should have come to us? This question may seem uncomfortable, even dangerous, but it is necessary, because at some point in our spiritual journey, we need to stop and reflect. Is what we are following the complete truth, or a molded narrative? And when you start looking at documents like the Dead Sea Scrolls, which have been hidden for centuries and almost forgotten from official history, this doubt stops being just theoretical. It becomes visceral. Now imagine the possibility that the true history of human spirituality is scattered in fragments that never reached the altar, texts that were never read by priests, prophecies that were never proclaimed aloud during a mass, revelations that were never allowed to become doctrine, fragments that did not pass the scrutiny of power, that were considered too dangerous, too daring, too subversive to become part of what we call faith today. And that brings us to an even deeper question. Why trust only texts that have been officially accepted if we know that there was a human, political, and selective process behind the choice of what should be read and what should be forgotten? Can true faith, that pure faith connected to the essence of the divine, really be confined in a book, in a dogma, in a structure created by men? The Dead Sea Scrolls are not just ancient texts. They are testaments to a time when spirituality was much broader, more mysterious, and more multifaceted than the simplified version we receive today. In them, we see descriptions of profound spiritual practices, sacred songs never heard before, visions of angels and demons in conflict, prophecies about light and darkness, teachings that value the awakening of consciousness, spiritual vigilance, and internal knowledge as paths of salvation. And this is precisely why these manuscripts challenge the structure of institutional faith, because they do not confirm what has been established. They question, they expand, they provoke, they show that there was more, much more, and that what has come down to us is just a fraction of a larger, more complex, and possibly truer whole. Have you ever stopped to think about the responsibility someone had in deciding that one book should be in the Bible and another shouldn't? That one prophecy should be proclaimed and another suppressed? That one gospel could be read by the faithful and another should be burned? Who are these people who shaped the spirituality of humanity? By what authority did they make these decisions? And what exactly were they trying to avoid by hiding certain texts? Perhaps it is precisely because these questions do not have simple answers that the Vatican chooses silence. Because when doubt sets in, it carries with it a powerful force, the desire to know more. And nothing is more dangerous for a structure that depends on blind belief than a people who begin to think with their own eyes, feel with their own hearts, and search with their own souls. And this search is not a mistake. On the contrary, it is the essence of the true spiritual path. Search, question, reflect, connect directly with what is sacred, without intermediaries, without filters, without censorship. The Dead Sea Scrolls represent this possibility, the chance to reconnect with a spirituality that has been silenced, which was marginalized, but which still pulses between the lines of forbidden texts, in forgotten fragments, in erased words. And the most surprising thing is that the more you delve into these texts, the more you realize that they are not contrary to faith. They are an invitation to faith, a deeper, more awakened, more conscious faith. A faith that does not need to be fueled by fear or guilt, but by truth and freedom. A faith that does not depend on human structures, but on spiritual revelations that transcend time and control. The plurality of views present in the manuscripts shows us that spirituality has never been a straight line. It has always been a mosaic, a tapestry of divine experiences, of understandings of the sacred, of human attempts to translate what is eternal. Reducing all of this to a single version, a single authorized path, is not only a historical injustice, but spiritual violence. Therefore, this institutional silence is not just the absence of speech, it is the presence of control. It's an attempt to stop the pieces from fitting together. Let your eyes open. May hearts awaken. That is why these texts are treated as taboo, as danger, as a threat, because they don't confirm the narrative. They deconstruct it, they reveal, they free, and you feel it. It doesn't matter how long you've been on the journey of faith. It doesn't matter your religion, your background, or your history. If you've come this far, it's because there's this same restlessness inside you, the feeling that something was left out. That part of the story is still missing, that what we have been taught may not be everything. And that's why I want to invite you now to leave the sentence in the comments. I want the missing fragments. Write this with intention, truly, with courage. This phrase is more than a phrase. It is a declaration of search, of awakening, of belonging to something greater than what we have been given. If you also feel that true spirituality has been fragmented, edited, silenced, share this video. Leave your comment. Write where you are watching from. Let's show that there are thousands of people around the world who are waking up, who are asking themselves the same questions, who are looking for the same answers. And while all this remains shrouded in mystery, silence, and oblivion, something begins to move discreetly behind the scenes. Independent researchers, dissident theologians, archaeologists, committed to the truth, and even some religious people who can no longer bear the omission, are beginning to speak out. A silent, but growing movement begins to take shape. The collective desire for the contents of the Dead Sea Scrolls to be finally revealed, interpreted honestly, and presented to the world without institutional filters. There are those who say that new discoveries are being made, that there are still undisclosed fragments hidden away from the eyes of the media, and that certain people, very close to the power structures, are trying to regain control of the narrative before it slips away completely. There are rumors about attempts to reinterpret ancient texts in a new theological light, carefully aligned with current doctrine, as a way of absorbing the impact and diverting focus from the most evident contradictions. It is as if we are about to witness an official re-editing of history, carefully prepared behind the scenes at the Vatican, before the pressure becomes unsustainable. But the big question remains: why wait so long? Why hide so much? Why treat these texts as if they were a threat when they could be a bridge to truth, a deeper connection to what is sacred? The prolonged silence only reinforces the suspicion that there is something much bigger being hidden. And perhaps, most frighteningly, is the realization that the choice to shut up may have been more effective than any direct ban. Why what is ignored by religious authorities is often also forgotten by the masses. But not now. Now there is a new type of believer emerging, a believer who not only wants to believe, but to understand. A believer who values faith, yes, but also demands transparency, respect, and, above all, access to the totality of spiritual truth. A believer who knows that if the Qumran scrolls contain information that has been censored for so long, it means they are too important to remain hidden. And perhaps this is precisely the question that needs to be asked most now. Do you believe that the Vatican should officially pronounce itself on the Qumran texts? Because if there's anything that needs to be discussed, this is it. Why does the Church, which presents itself as the guardian of truth and faith, refuse to address this topic with the clarity and seriousness it demands? If this question also makes sense to you, comment below, and let's open this debate. Your opinion matters. Every comment here is a way of showing that the world is waking up, that people want to know, they want to understand, they want access to what has always been hidden. And if you want more revelations like this, leave the like right now. This helps this video reach others who are also searching for the truth. Subscribe to the channel and activate the bell, because in the next videos, we're going to delve even deeper into the clues that are coming to light. And maybe you're about to hear something that's never been said in public before. What if everything you ever believed about the creation of the world was incomplete, or worse, distorted? What if there was an ancient text, forgotten among the caves of Qumran, that told a completely different story from the one we have heard since our first steps in faith? Not a fable or a spiritual metaphor, but rather an ancient story, written by hands that lived millennia before us, describing the origin of existence with details that never reached church pulpits. Among the Dead Sea Scrolls, there are fragments that simply do not fit into the traditional Genesis narrative, excerpts that present a new version of creation, where the beginning of everything is not limited to the separation of light and darkness in 7 days, but a much more mystical, symbolic and, for many, even disturbing process. A text that suggests that the universe was formed through conflicting spiritual forces, and that the creation of humanity is linked not only to the divine breath, but to a conscious intervention of entities that defy everything we know as the unique God of the Judeo-Christian tradition. This manuscript, which remained hidden for centuries, speaks of layers of reality, from a pre-existing spiritual world, of non-human intelligences that participated in the creative process, and even from a fall before the fall of Adam, a cosmic fall that would have impacted the very fabric of creation. None of this is mentioned in the Bible as we know it, and maybe that's why it was conveniently left out, hidden, silenced, but it exists. And the most disconcerting thing is that this is not a simple linguistic variation of Genesis. It is a completely independent account, written in a tone of deep spiritual revelation, which refers to much older traditions, possibly of Mesopotamian origin, with traces of Hebrew mysticism and influences of wisdom that was erased from the official history of faith. Why doesn't anyone talk about this manuscript? Why is it not studied in theological schools? Why doesn't any religious leader mention him in public? The answer, once again, appears to be the same. Because it threatens the foundation. It shifts the center. It forces you to retell the story from the beginning. And retelling the beginning means reevaluating everything that came after. Every dogma, every sacrament, every teaching consolidated by tradition. This text, if placed in the hands of the right people, can reignite the search for an ancestral spirituality, connected not to hierarchy, but to the direct experience of the sacred. You can knock down walls. It can free consciences. It can put into the hands of the people what was kept only for the initiated, for those who always knew more, but never told everything. And the most intriguing thing is to think that this is not the only manuscript with this power. There are others, fragments that speak of forgotten lineages, of lost sacred symbols, of words that were removed from the texts because they contain too much force. Creation as we know it may just be the authorized version, and this hidden manuscript may be the missing link that connects us to what has been hidden from the beginning. Now, imagine being able to read this text with your own eyes, reflect on it, interpret it, feel the energy it carries, not through the filter of the institution, but with the freedom that only true search can offer. Imagine what it would be like to discover that what you believe to be the beginning may never have been fully told. What if I told you that I didn't? In the next video, you will see this text, line by line, section by section. You will understand why it was hidden for centuries and why its revelation could shake the structures of traditional faith. What is written there is not easy to hear, but once you listen, you can't go back. If this touched you, If it awakened something in you, comment the sentence below. I want to know the true beginning. Write this and share this video with anyone you know who also feels like there is something missing. Leave a like now, if you haven't already, and subscribe to the channel, because we're just beginning to peel back the veil on what's been buried in time, and what comes next will challenge everything you believe.